This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hanley, at New College, Oxford, that you'll see on your sheets. He's going to be talking to us about moving beyond Equiano and slavery in the study of 18th century Black British writing.
Hello, they shouldn't make academics talk after proper writers, make us look bad. So I'm just going to be just reading really from a paper, sorry. So, this is John Jay. He's one of the lesser known early Black British writers. So, in a sense, this portrait of the African Methodist preacher and author John Jay reflects the current state of scholarship on most black writers in Britain during the long 18th century. We have an outline of the individual. We can see enough possibly to infer that he is black, and the caption below the image, proudly declaring him to be an African preacher of the gospel, gives us a hint towards how he spent much of his time. Beyond that, however, he is obscure to us. Silhouette portraits like this were made by reflecting a focused, steady light onto the sitter, casting a shadow onto a piece of paper behind them. This was then outlined using a pencil and later filled in with black ink. As you might expect, this was the cheapest way to produce a likeness around the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when Jay published the autobiography, for which his portrait acted as the frontispiece. The result of the process is much like a shadow itself: outline without detail, the shape of a human being without its corresponding personality, form without substance. When we begin the process of researching lesser-known early black writers like Jay, we set ourselves the challenge of bringing clarity, nuance, and depth to the two-dimensional impressions they left behind in the record. So, not all early black writers are drawn so basically in the popular and indeed academic historical imagination. This portrait, which is often supposed to depict the famous abolitionist Equiano, is perhaps the most detailed of all. More is known about Equiano than any other person to be enslaved during the 18th century. As of this month, the British Library currently holds 168 secondary peer-reviewed materials published since 1960 with Equiano in the title. John Jay, by comparison, appears 6 times. The catalogue of Oxford's Bodleian Library, the Copyright Library, lists 153 published peer-reviewed articles for which Equiano is listed as a keyword, and 54 full published books. Jay has 2 peer-reviewed articles and 1 book, which is a modern edition of his autobiography. This is to say nothing of chapters in edited collections, which are not included in either search engine, and it's impossible to say just how many web pages and blog posts are dedicated to Equiano's travels. In academic circles, Vincent Caretta's discovery of documentation indicating that Equiano was born in South Carolina and not in Africa, as he claimed, generated a memorable debate with Paul Lovejoy, which stretched over 5 published articles by itself. Teachers and researchers have access to 2 full-length biographies of Equiano, one by James Walvin and another more extensive by Caretta, and Lovejoy is currently writing a 3rd, which was, I think, just to get it Vincent Caretta. Considering that Equiano initially came into widespread fame primarily for writing an autobiography, a staggering amount of effort has since been put into reconstructing the events of his life. One reason for the overwhelming focus on this one particular individual is the tendency for Black British history, and especially 18th century Black British history, to be subsumed into histories of slavery and abolition. As the highest profile black abolitionist ever active in this country, Equiano has assumed something approaching canonical status in the study of 18th century black literature and indeed black history as a whole. Clearly, it's no bad thing that such a figure has finally found a place on almost all core history syllabi at both university and school levels. History is the third least popular university subject for black school leavers in the UK, beating only agriculture and veterinary medicine. This situation, it seems clear, is owing to the fact that black people, including their central and fundamental roles in the abolition movement, are too frequently excised from discussions about our shared national past. Nevertheless, a too great focus on one individual figure and his contribution to one specific movement, often to the exclusion of all others, also throws up a number of hazards which remain to be fully negotiated. The biggest danger is that Equiano be seen as somehow representative of a monolithic and homogeneous black experience, when in reality, and as suggested by the title of his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative, his was among the most unusual and unlikely stories of survival to emerge during the period. We must remain mindful that Equiano's powerfully eloquent interventions in slavery debates between 1789 and 1794 were products of and contributions to a very specific set of political and social circumstances in Britain and the British Atlantic. These stemmed in part from the spread of French revolutionary ideals and indeed an increased local black presence following the American Revolution. So, in other words, Equiano's abolitionism emerged from a combination of his own experiences within the slave system and a whole host of other political, social and religious contingencies, rather than the mere, though obviously highly relevant fact that he was black. Now, this may sound obvious, but the relative slowness with which scholars have recognised the true variety of early black British writing suggests that we've been looking to confirm a couple of assumptions about such authors' views in 18th century Britain. Namely, these assumptions are, number one, that black people were all interested in the issue of slavery and abolition, and two, that they were all active abolitionists who felt exactly the same way about slavery and abolition. These assumptions are damaging because the history of slavery is both smaller and larger than just black history. Smaller in the sense that black people were central actors in almost every aspect of 18th century British life and did not confine their interests to just one or two issues. And larger in the sense that slavery is not just black history, it's everyone's history, it's British history. The legacies of our involvement in slavery constitute a shared heritage, touching on the lives of every single person living in Britain today. To conflate black history with the histories of slavery and abolition is not only to deny our collective responsibility for our past, but it is also to flatten and obscure our understanding of the contributions of black intellectuals to our so-called national story. So I'd like to move on now to a couple of examples of this tendency to understand 18th century black writing primarily or solely as abolitionist literature, and to discuss how we might begin to reread this work as part of a move to centralise black agency in broader narratives of British history, without falling back on notions of either paragonism or victimhood. So, next to Equiano, Ignatius Sancho is probably the best known black author of the period. Born aboard a slave ship in 1729, Sancho was brought to England at the age of 2 and raised in Greenwich. Having taught himself to read and write in secret, he entered domestic service as a butler to the Duchess of Montagu in 1749, later working as a valet to her son-in-law George Montagu, the Duke of Montagu. He was discharged in 1774 due to ill health and spent the last of his days as a proprietor of a grocery shop in Charles Street, Westminster, catering to high-end customers, sort of socially elite customers he had met while working for the Montagues. He died in December 1780. Now, for much of his life, Sancho maintained a correspondence with a wide circle of his well-to-do friends, and a number of these letters were collected and published posthumously in 1782 for the benefit of his widow and children. It's obvious from a reading of his letters that Sancho was immensely popular and well-loved by a wide circle of his friends, Indeed, 2 panegyric poems and a lengthy elegy were published in the months after his death. This is an excerpt from one of them. Yet, posterity has not been unilaterally kind to Sancho. His failure to attack the institution of slavery forcefully or directly enough in his private correspondence led to an unflattering academic consensus that lasted into the 1990s that saw him as obsequious or assimilationist. Fuller and Schilling called him the golden black boy of the English aristocracy and gentry. In Sukhdev Sandhu's words, Sancho has often been condemned by critics and historians for being a ludicrous, preening traitor to his race. More recently, literary critics such as Mark Mellis and Britton Carey have led a revision of this image, foregrounding his famous exchange of letters with Lawrence Sterne on the issue of slavery as evidence of his credentials as an early abolitionist. Using his insider status in the world of polite 18th century sociability, Sancho was able to attack slavery and proto-racist ideology from within the hegemonic structures that created and reinforced them. His playful but enormously sophisticated deployment of the tropes of literary sensibility, irony, and humour made him one of the most powerful and effective opponents of dismissive attitudes towards black intellectual capacity. Sancho's published letters, therefore, are now routinely framed in the scholarly discussion as anti-slavery literature. It seems clear now that of the two, the second revisionist interpretation of Sancho's work is the more compelling. However, in both cases, Sancho's attitudes towards slavery and ethnicity eclipsed the commitments and characteristics for which he was best remembered by his friends. It's often overlooked, for example, that his collected correspondence stand alongside Samuel Richardson's writing manuals as among the finest published examples of the form of the 18th century familiar letter. While Sancho's talents as a music theorist and classical composer, incidentally the earliest known black classical composer, are sometimes mentioned in passing, to date no full musicological assessment has been made of his several surviving pieces. Similarly, while his commitment to literary sensibility in the sentimental mode has been explored, as I mentioned, such explorations are framed exclusively with reference to his exchange of letters with Sterne, which are among the very few that deal with slavery. Our picture is distorted further by the fact that, as Soren Hammerschmidt has pointed out, Sancho's editor Francis Crewe emphasised the extent to which his ethnicity impacted upon his writing. And in my own research, I've discovered that Crewe actually inserted references to Sancho's blackness into his letters in an attempt to elicit sympathy from the 18th century reader. So on the right you can see the published version of the letters after addition from Francis Crewe. So she just added a sort of a clause that draws attention to Sancho's blackness where none existed in the manuscript version. So in focusing so closely on Sancho the abolitionist and anti-racist campaigner, therefore we run the risk of missing Sancho the raconteur, Sancho the composer, Sancho the friendly oracle, as he was known to his friends, Sancho the political commentator, and Sancho the husband and father. Our understanding of this complicated and warm-hearted man becomes negotiated primarily by reference to the colour of his skin. In reality, black writers influenced and were influenced by far more than just the abolition debates, and sometimes this led to difficult compromises. The history of early black British writing offers a number of examples of authors whose interests in particular movements appear to set them at odds with the type of anti-slavery position to which we might assume them to adhere. I've written elsewhere about James Albert Eucorsor Broniasaw, the first published black author in Britain, whose lifelong association with predestinarian Calvinism, and particularly slave-owning British Calvinists, led him to produce an autobiography that celebrated enslavement as a means of Christianization. Indeed, the relationship between non-conforming Christianity and black authorship characterised some of the most problematic instances of anti-interventionism in this period. The pacifist dimension of Wesleyan and Episcopal Methodism, for example, demanded that religious writers such as Boston King and John Jay, we don't have any pictures of them at all, we don't even have silhouettes of those writers, by the way. So the pacifist dimensions, of their religions demanded that these authors preach to the enslaved the supposed value of passivity and forbearance in their confessional autobiographies. Emancipation in these texts was best achieved by forbearance and prayer, and should only be sought in the afterlife. Perhaps as a result of their supposedly compromised positions on slavery, these three authors have received very little in the way of modern scholarly attention. When they are discussed, it is telling that they are routinely misdescribed as abolitionist writers. If we wish to explain the stance occupied by writers such as Gronier, King and Jay, we must recognise the extent to which their perspectives were influenced by their respective social, political and professional networks, as well as the temporal circumstances surrounding the publication of their work. So, for example, Gronier's family were poverty-stricken and on the brink of starvation when he composed his narrative in 1772. The only friends to whom he could appeal for help were Calvinists, who just then were under attack from their rivals, the Wesleyans, over their support of slavery. So we shouldn't be surprised that he didn't insult those upon whom his children's survival depended at that time. Similarly, the sermons in Jay's autobiography advocating passive obedience were originally delivered near the docks in Liverpool in 1805. If he preached armed slave rebellion in the style of his contemporary, the mulatto radical Robert Wedderburn, for example, not only would he have gained little traction with his congregation, but he would also have placed himself in considerable physical danger. An awareness of how they were constrained by social and political factors highlights how these figures were actually central to a broad range of British concerns and networks of influence. By researching and teaching lesser-known figures like Gronier, King and Jay, and paying attention to the various historical contingencies affecting their work, we can identify the centrally significant contributions of black intellectuals to every aspect of 18th century British society. And by revisiting familiar figures like Ignatius Sancho, we can begin to appreciate just how influential these intellectuals were within their respective circles. This doesn't take anything away from the vitally important work of abolitionists like Equiano and Equiano and Wedderburn. I would reiterate that there's still work to be done to demonstrate just how central black abolitionism was. It's a story that's still not been told, so we still need to be doing that, but I'm saying we can look broader than that as well. So it doesn't take anything away from black abolitionists, rather it serves to embrace and celebrate the fact that a far greater variety of black voices existed. It's part of the bigger project to show that black history is not at the peripheries, but at the very core of British history. Finally, it serves to bring these lesser-known authors and the roles they had to play out from the shadows cast by their more celebrated and well-known peers.